are here, Cardiff Central Library.
Talk, Dylan Thomas, here, upstairs. Follow me, follow me.
Hello. Right, we will start then. Well, thank you for the invite. It's fun. It's really good to share something with you about Dylan Thomas. My name's Alun, and this gentleman's name is Geoff. You're going to hear a little bit about the story of Dylan and the house where he was born in Swansea. Dylan Thomas has been in the news so much in the last year. Your timing of asking to hear about him is right on point. This is an interview I did in Dylan Thomas's birthplace with Cerys Matthews, from a Radio 6 presenter, former member of the Welsh group Catatonia. She has just worked on her own version of Dylan's famous work Under Milk Wood, her own adaptation with lovely, lovely illustrations done by an artist. So I interviewed her about that. Who's this guy? Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
Johnny Depp called in the house when he was in Swansea with his band Hollywood Vampires. The band were playing in Swansea and Johnny Depp wanted to find time to come to see the house where Dylan Thomas was born. So that says a lot about how popular and influential Dylan Thomas is, that in the middle of his schedule he wanted to spend some time when he came to the house. He was there for a couple of hours and he was very, very interested in Dylan and knew a lot about Dylan as well.
And he was introduced to Dylan as a 10-year-old. His brother gave him a book, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog, which is a Dylan story, and that got him hooked onto Dylan. The house was the only place that he'd asked to come and visit on his UK tour.
And then, more recently, this year, somebody released a single, and then there was another interest when Taylor Swift's new single mentions Dylan Thomas, which was quite something, and Patti Smith in the same line. And that caused a completely different response and reaction. Johnny Depp was obviously one type. The other people I mentioned caused their own response in their own circles. But Taylor Swift was a different one again, and all of a sudden we've got Dylan in the TikTok generation, which is a new push again. Helped as well by the fact that Patti Smith messaged Taylor Swift directly and said, "Thank you for mentioning me in the same line as Dylan Thomas." But it's a good question. Who's Dylan Thomas anyway? That's what we're going to try and answer. And as you see, it's really good time to ask that question, who is Dylan Thomas? Because there's a lot of people have shown a lot of interest in him over the years, but this year has had those highlights. And of course, just an example there, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is one of Thomas's most famous and powerful poems. And there is another one there, The Force That Through the Green Fuse Drives the Flower. So his work is making the point here that his work is translated into languages throughout the world, as well as well-known people. We're going to hear a little bit more about the man.
Who was Dylan? Who was his family? Well, his family came from a fairly poor background. His grandfather, on his father's side, was a guard on the railways, but his father, David John, or he was known as DJ Thomas, he'd won a scholarship to Aberystwyth University. And he came out of Aberystwyth with a first-class honours degree in English. He was the only person in his family the first person in his family to go to the university, and the only person in Wales to get a first that year. So he expected to get a job as a university lecturer. That never happened, and he ends up teaching Shakespeare to small boys in Swansea Grammar School, which to him was not the most fulfilling of occupations. I think there were two reasons why he didn't get that job. One, he was a fairly cynical person. He didn't suffer fools and told people what he thought of them. And two, he was from a working class background, and the universities would have been very middle class orientated, so he just didn't fit into that environment. So because he was discontent and he felt that he should have had that academic post, he wanted to show that he had really arrived, and he bought this house, which was at the time in the posh part of Swansea. It was a huge move up the social ladder. Before living there, they had lived in small terraced houses. Dylan was born a few months after they bought the house in 1914. He was born in the front bedroom, and he lived in the house for 23 years, and he wrote 2/3 of his published work while living in the house. So I think it's the most important house in Dylan's life.
In those 23 years, obviously Dylan came under many, many influences. And between the ages of 15 and 19, when he still lived in the house with his mum and dad, he filled 5 notebooks with over 200 poems. It was a very prolific period for Dylan. But then when he's 19, he gets his first volume of poetry published. And that volume is full of poems from the notebooks. When he is 21, just about, he gets his second volume of poetry published. And that volume, the second one, is also full of poems from the notebooks. So what we are in effect saying is that Dylan's first 2 volumes of poetry that made the London poetry world sit up and take notice were full of the works of a teenager. And that bit in Dylan's story is easily overlooked because of more kind of tabloid headlines that happened later in his life, possibly. But it is quite something. And not only that, with all due respect to Swansea, at that time it would have been a case of people in London saying, Swansea? Where's that? That's this small, out-of-the-way, backwater town in far-away West Wales. And this teenage boy from that dark place has written this. So that was the impact that Dylan had. And a lot of the early influence on Dylan's writing in that house came from that room, which is his father's study. After Dylan had died, his mum, Florrie, gave an interview in which she said that she remembered her husband, DJ, Dylan's dad, reading Shakespeare to Dylan in that room when Dylan was 4. But looking at it the other way, it says a great deal about the influences on Dylan, because Dylan also had Shakespeare read to him, had Dickens read to him, and stories from the Bible. So from 4 years old, he was hearing all this. He didn't understand Hamlet. He didn't understand Oliver Twist, but he was hearing the stories. He didn't go to school until he was 7 years old. So there were 3 years there when he was being read stories by his dad, predominantly in that room. So he was learning to understand and to enjoy the sound of words, the patterns of saying something, the patterns of speech. This is Dylan's bedroom, where we saw Johnny Depp sat earlier on, and that's the very short bed. Dylan used to say that his room was so small that you had to go out to turn round. But he did most of his writing in that room at the time he was in the house. So all that prolific writing of those poems that are in the notebooks between 15 and 19, he'd have done most of it in that room there. And he has some photographs of some of his literary heroes, some film star heroes. Greta Garbo is on the mantelpiece on the far right over there, for those who know Greta Garbo. So that, and then you can also see Geoff referred to Nancy not liking the fact that Dylan used to take things from her. Now that scarf there is a kind of a tribute to the fact that Dylan also used to take some of his sister's scarves and wear them like a cravat under his silk shirts, because he had an idea of the image a poet should have as well. But the writing influences in the study before and in that room there, and that's another view of the bedroom, and that's an example of his writing. It is very neat and disciplined and organised, And everybody thinks, oh, Dylan was this mad, crazy Welsh poet, but he was a very, very disciplined writer. And he would take time and care over every word that he wrote. And of course, in those days, there was no cut and paste. So if he made a mistake, wrap the paper up, throw it in the bin, start again. But he was a very disciplined writer, and it's good to remember that, and that's another picture of him, of his bedroom. You get an idea as to how small it is.
You can almost touch the walls.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing about that room is that once you've closed that door, you are in your own little world. He also said there's enough room for a bed, a desk, a chair, and a view of a blank wall opposite. So you were in that little space. If the doorbell rang, you wouldn't go and answer it because you were locked up in a... So everywhere that Dylan went, he wrote to any extent. He had a writing room like this.
Yeah.
He had a gypsy caravan when he spent some time in Chelsea. He had a building called the Apple House in Newquay and the writing shed in Larne. But that all came from this little room.
It's a very small space, and it's just him and his imagination and his creativity.
And everything in there he refers to, or his friends refer to.
And then after he left, when he was 23 years old, and as mentioned, you can trace 2/3 of everything that Dylan had published back to the birthplace that we've just seen. He then started on the next part of his life, which was fair to say in kind of stark contrast to the 23 years in the uplands. It was a little bit more colourful, a little bit more bohemian and itinerant, on the move, never staying much longer than 2 years in any one place. And then towards the end of his life, something happened, played into his story that Geoff will now pick up. He discovered, or America discovered him. What was the point?
Yeah, so Dylan always felt that the Holy Grail was to go to America because that was the land of milk and honey, and he would make a fortune there. And in many ways he did make a fortune, but he was one of these people, if he had money, he spent it. If he didn't have money, he borrowed it. And he would, again, so when he learned how to deal with his men and his women, if he had friends who he respected, he borrowed money from them and paid them back. If he had friends who he didn't respect, he would never pay them back, and he even take clothes from them. But he managed to exist as a poet and a writer, and certainly very few poets manage to exist on their writing alone. But I say, America was the place he wanted to go to, and in 1949, John Malcolm Brennan, who was the director of poetry at the Young Men and Women's Hebrew Association in New York, invited him to America, and he went 4 times to America on lecture tours. It was not quite what he was expecting. It was a very arduous time. He would give a talk in one town, go on a plane or a train to another town, do another talk, and then to another one. And in 2 ways, he became the first rock star. He was one of the very first people who did this big touring tour of places in America. I think that it started off that they booked places that held 200 people. Those sold out, and then they were booking places that held 1,000 or 2,000 people. So he was famous in that respect, and also in the way that he behaved when he was in America, because he was fated as a star. Everything was available to him. If you wanted a drink, he'd go drink. If you wanted cigarettes, cigarettes. There were women falling over to get into bed with him, and he was somebody who I think was not above temptation. But that was his
and that particular photo kind of captures it quite well, because he's in the offices of Vogue magazine, and he's a poet. But Dylan, that's a photograph taken by the photographer Lee Miller. And the fact that I love that photo, I think it's something quite poignant about it. But yeah, he's a poet from Swansea in the Vogue offices in New York. Gives a good example of how he was fated.
And the first time that Charles Sisters in Wales was published was actually in a magazine called Harper's Bazaar, which is another fashion magazine. And that was on Dylan's first visit to America. He was asked if he would write a Christmas story, and he said, I've done it twice already. He's written one for Picture Post magazine, one for the BBC, and he said, I've got no inspiration. And they said, well, you get paid for it. So he amalgamated his two versions that he'd done before, which came out as A Child's Christmas, and he sold it to a lady called Pearl Kazan, who was an editor on Harper's Bazaar, and he then had an affair with her, and she followed him back to this country. And he thought, well, nobody, they met up in London, and he said, nobody knows I'm here. So they went off to Brighton for the weekend. Unbeknown to him, his main benefactor, Margaret Taylor, who had bought a number of houses for him to live in, including the boathouse in Larne. He heard all about it, and she was totally obsessed by Dylan and very jealous of any woman that got anywhere close to him. So she was so incensed by this, that what he was doing, that she told Catlin, his wife, where he was, and when he got home to Larne, he didn't get quite the warm welcome he was expecting. And in many ways, that was the beginning of the end of his marriage. It was very rocky from then on, and that's the starting point of it. This is the reading of Under Milk Wood. The first time Under Milk Wood was performed was in 92Y, the Young People's Hebrew Association, on the 14th of May 1953, when he had an audience, actors, and himself doing the narration. And he told them before they started, they were getting a bit nervous about it. He just said, love the words. I think that's the whole thing about Dylan, is ever since the age of 4, he loved the word. This is him in the White Horse Tavern in New York. This is his favourite watering hole in New York. It's very much like a British pub in Greenwich Village.
That's a photo I took outside the same gents.
There are photographs around all the walls. There's actually a photograph of the birthplace in there, which has been there for the last fortnight. My daughter went to New York a fortnight ago.
It's still a Dylan shrine, as you can see. And it's in Greenwich Village in New York.
Well, when she went there a fortnight ago and was talking to the manager, he said, oh, it's funny, he said, a lot of people come in and ask about Dylan Thomas. I thought, well, you haven't been into your back room to see what's on the wall.
Yeah, but I mean, that brings us round to the kind of conclusion. I mean, that's in the White Horse Tavern as well. And until it was refurbished, there was a very similar arrangement of bottles in Brown's Hotel in Larne, which was Dylan's local, but that's no longer there, unfortunately. But that one, well, it was there when I took that photo. And that hints on something I said earlier, that the fact that Dylan was a teenage poet is easily overlooked when he first hit the scene and when he first made his big critical and public impression. It's easily overlooked because people think he was just a drunkard. And those are the tabloid headlines. I did a video on Dylan's life years back, and I interviewed people on the streets of Swansea, and there was a woman by her stand selling the Evening Post newspaper, shouting out Evening Post, and so I went up to her and I said, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I said, what do you think, have you heard of Dylan Thomas? She said, yeah. I said, what do you think of him? She said, nice poet, but a drunken bum. And that really kind of sums up what a lot of people think. And I think that's hugely unfair. He did drink. I'm not painting him as an angel either. But I'm not sure his drinking was more excessive than most people of the time. He just happened to do it, as Geoff mentioned earlier. He was a poet in the public eye. He was in Vogue magazine offices having a photo taken by a Vogue photographer. He was a poet who had all that attention, and therefore we got to know more about his drinking. Did it contribute to his death? Well, Dylan famously said about the night in November 1953, I've had 18 straight whiskies. I think it's a record. And everybody thinks, well, Dylan died because he had 18 straight whiskies. No, he didn't. For a start, I'm not sure he could have actually got as far as 18 straight whiskies, because it would have been American measures, which were bigger than the British ones, so that would have been
3 bottles.
3 bottles. I mean, he wouldn't have got that far. So it was just Dylan playing to the crowd. No, I've had 18 straight whiskies. He'd say similar things at different circumstances in his life. So it wasn't the case that he drunk himself to death. Yes, he had been out in the White Horse. Went back from there to the Chelsea Hotel, the famous Chelsea Hotel, associated with so many other stars, like Andy Warhol and so many other different people. Taken ill and then taken from the Chelsea Hotel to St Vincent's Hospital in a coma he didn't recover from. And that he was there for a good few days. And basically, a lot of work has been done recently as to exactly how he died. A lot of it is due to medical negligence. A lot of it is due to the fact they didn't have his records because they were obviously back home. And they gave him something that he shouldn't have had because of a condition he had. But it's not fair to say that he drank himself to death. He did turn to drink. A drink was a way, as Geoff's already said, to cope with the fame. Because as I said earlier, he was this guy from small town Swansea that nobody had ever heard of. And all of a sudden, he's huge in America. I mean, he lived at home with mum and dad until he was 23 in a part of Swansea. How do you cope with that when all of a sudden it goes from that to out there? For a poet, nobody else could tell you this is what you do, Dylan, because no other poet had that acclaim. Another story that I love is that he went to Dylan Thomas, just to show how well known he was. He went to a party in Charlie Chaplin's house. Shelley Winters, Marilyn Monroe, these were the people, and yet they wanted Dylan there as a poet. And it's a lot to deal with, a lot for him to cope with. So he did turn to drink as a coping mechanism. And I think that's true of pretty much most people at some point in their lives, you know. But yeah, he does. That little boy started his life in Cumdonkin Drive and created quite a stir in the poetry world. His first response was a critical acclaim, then it was the public acclaim. People were buying his poetry in his lifetime, which again is not that common. Not unheard of, I'm not saying that, but they were buying his poetry in his lifetime. He's a fascinating character, very difficult person to understand, very difficult person to get on with sometimes, but an actual genius in terms of words, because, as Geoff said, he loved words, and that comes across very clearly in pretty much everything